Today we're going to be bringing the legendary Jedi Master Yoda to life. Now, I love the original trilogy's puppet, but I realize that I have way more of an attachment to the prequel design. I mean, I literally dressed up as him for Halloween when I was 9, and you better believe I was rocking those Grandmaster Yoda with a lightsaber vibes, so prequel it is. I'll be resin printing all of these Yoda pieces. Frozen recently sent me over one of their Mega 8KS machines to test out, so it seemed like the perfect time to finally get around to building a life-size Yoda. I decided to start with the feet, and I also kept these as solid resin pieces, which is why you see me really making sure that they're well supported here. The support projection tool in Lychee is one of my favorites. You select the area you want the supports to be generated in, can modify the intervals, and then clean everything up easily with the parent tool. Even then, I do still find myself going in and manually adding a few supports in here and there just to make sure that everything is supported appropriately. For this build, I went with a mixture of ABS-like and Superflex resin. It just gives it a bit more flexibility and toughness so that the parts are less likely to crack or chip in any way. Especially for Yoda, he has quite long nails that I feel like would be pretty prone to be broken off if you weren't careful, so anything to just try and mitigate any issues like that happening, I was absolutely on board for. The feet were also a good place to start because they ended up being the shortest print job at about 10.5 hours, and when that print job was finished, I hung the build plate on the drip hanger to let all of the excess resin drip back into the vat. And once I left that for a little bit, here is what the feet were looking like. There's still some excess resin on the surface of these prints, but once that's being cleaned off, you can really see the incredible detail that are in these feet. But on to the next round of pieces. I went with the hands and arms. I managed to fit all of them onto the single build plate, and I also hollowed these parts. I still kept them with like a 4mm shell, so they're not going to be weak by any means. The only real reason that I kept the feet solid is because I thought the added weight at the bottom of him might be beneficial. Once they were finished, I again let them drip dry, and this is what they looked like still on the build plate. The next round of pieces was the torso and legs. Now, clearly this is not exactly a clothed Yoda. I'm specifically printing the body-only version of these files so that I can add a fabric jumpsuit and robe later. And while I also decided to keep these parts hollow, I did a few tricks that I wanted to talk about. I added some hollowing blockers, specifically on the torso around the arm area to hopefully make that area a bit stronger. You know, that is where the arms are having to go, but this also made the printing process a lot easier, especially on these legs. You can see on the original hollow model how you have these squares just floating in midair, and these are on the bottom of the legs, so they are really floating, and there's not really an easy place to put any supports to help these print. But by adding a hollow blocker, it means that I can turn this entire section solid, which means I don't have to worry about any support. I still had it that the hole was going to run through this solid section, so it wasn't affecting the drainage for the resin whatsoever, and it does somewhat also have the benefit of being extra strong around the areas where parts start attaching to each other. I pretty much maxed out this printer's build volume with these two pieces on the single build plate, and even though these were mostly hollow other than those two solid areas that I added in, they still used like 1.7 liters of resin. They are very impressive looking pieces though, given that they are printed in resin. They have all of that incredible detail all over them, but because of all of the weight and just the size of the pieces, these ones were a bit unruly to deal with, but I managed in the end. But this brings us to our last round of pieces. I modified the head file to remove the eyes so that I could add my own custom ones, but because I want to do this, it means that I need a way to actually install these eyes. I thought about chopping off the neck essentially so that I could get my hand into this piece, but I realized it wasn't actually going to be large enough for me to get my hand into, so that is why I ended up slicing off the back of Yoda's head. So sorry for scarring you all. I also added the cane to this build plate, honestly because I kind of forgot he even had a cane, and so I figured I need this printed, so let's just add it to this build plate at the same time. So while this head print does admittedly look quite creepy right now because it is lacking the necessary eyes, these prints once again turned out so beautifully. It's so cool to see Yoda come to life. I mean, he's such an iconic character that just being able to create something like this in your own home is honestly still mind-blowing to me. Here I'm using my heat gun pen to gradually loosen the support material on these prints. I did end up cleaning them off beforehand, but cleaning all these prints is just the most boring footage in the world, so did not film that. If you've never tried using heat to loosen support material on resin prints, you absolutely need to. Once it's heated enough, it will basically just peel off kind of like Velcro. With these large pieces, I end up using a lot of heavy support, so it is definitely not the easiest thing in the world to remove. The heat just makes it so much easier, and it also leaves the final surface without too many blemishes. You're still going to have a few of those craters here and there, especially with the heavy support. It's just sort of unavoidable. That's why some strategic planning of print orientation is always good. Once I'd gotten all of the support material removed from the parts, I then went ahead and cured everything. And here's what all of Yoda's pieces were looking like now that all of them have been cleaned off, support material removed, and you can truly see all of the incredible detail these pieces have. And I could not resist doing a bit of a test fit. I mean, all of these have been separate pieces this far, and so I really wanted to see what they all looked like together. I also won't be assembling the majority of these parts together because I need to be able to dress him later on. But what I could actually glue together were the torso and leg pieces, the two halves of the cane. I didn't actually need to split this, but I thought that it might print easier if I did, so that is why it ended up in two pieces. And lastly were the hands to the arms. I did a bit of filing. It was the only post-processing I did on any of these parts, and it was just to sand down a bit of where that support material had been to make the two parts fit together a little better. Originally, I wasn't even sure if I would be able to attach the hands permanently or if they would get in the way of being able to actually get the sleeves over the hand. These parts don't flex, but the Yoda's sleeves are quite large, so it wasn't an issue, and it also meant that I could get rid of the seam between the two pieces. Same for the cane. I'm just using a bit of UV resin in this fine tipped bottle and then cure it with a handheld UV light and gradually work across the seam that I'm trying to make disappear. And once I'd gotten that all filled in, sanded it down to hopefully make this look like it was always one solid piece. The part that needed the majority of the work though was the head, and I couldn't do anything to it until I had these eyes installed. So I used my method of printing out the actual iris, gluing it on to a printed and painted eye insert, and then putting this inside of a small clear Christmas ornament half. It just gives the whole thing a nice uniform glossy appearance. It ends up looking like a glass eye. Originally I thought I would be able to get away with the cabochon trick that I like doing as well, but Yoda's eye cavity, I guess we will call it, was a lot more spherical, so plan B it was. And these just end up getting glued into the inside of the head while I still can with this back removed. But now that these eyes are finished and installed, it means that I can now start working on the back of the head. First step was just gluing the back head slice onto the rest of the head, and once that had dried, I then began to work on making this seam disappear. Now, this seam was a lot more intense, and it's also going to be a lot more visible in the end, so I did a bit more work with it with using some more of my resin filler that has some silica powder, I believe is what's mixed into this one. This is like my extra thick recipe, which literally just means it has more powder mixed in than if I didn't want it as thick. But I also started to use a sponge to create more of that skin texture to really hopefully make this seam completely disappear within the head. And the last thing I needed to do with this head was make it paint ready. Of course, I did need to install those eyes, but I also don't want to get paint all over them. So I used some blue poster tack to mask the eyes off. I figured it was probably the best option for really being able to get into all of those tiny nooks and crannies rather than using something like masking tape. And this should be easily removed later when I don't need it there anymore. We're going to begin this painting process with priming all of the pieces first. Went with a gray primer this time around. Anytime that I'm painting something more natural, I typically go for a mid-tone as opposed to white or black, unless of course that creature was a darker or extremely light color, but normally mid-tones is really where you can get a nice value range or be able to see the value range, even though after all of these pieces are primed, I am going to go in with a base coat of green. I had quite a lot of surface area to cover, so I just ended up mixing up my own custom paint. I use a lot of craft paint when I airbrush, and I never have a recipe for this. I just wing it. I use airbrush medium and water and other various airbrush thinners to get it to the consistency that I feel like is going to make it through my airbrush. And this got sprayed over anything that was going to get painted later on. So for the arms and the torso, I basically just sort of stopped at the extremities because you're literally never going to see the rest of the body once the robes are on. The next paint color we're going to be adding to this once the base layer has dried is the highlight color. So I mixed up this light green shade, and I'm very specifically switching to this airbrush because it has this MAC valve on it. Now, this is something that I sort of stalked out of these Sideshow Collectibles painting videos that I love to watch, and all of their painters tend to use the same Iwata Highline airbrush that has the separate MAC valve. And I think the reason why they do this, especially, well, the ones that I am typically watching are the ones that are painting the more natural types of statues, and I think they use it because the MAC valve gives you extreme control over the splatteriness, I guess we will call it, of what the airbrush produces. So you can get this really interesting textured and natural effect that you would start to see on like skin and stuff. You can also look at modifying the air pressure on just your compressor, but the MAC valve being on the physical airbrush is just a lot more convenient, and overall I just really like the effect that this particular airbrush will give me, especially when painting these natural types of objects. I just feel like it gives a really nice natural effect. Now, you probably can barely tell that I'm doing anything to these pieces because I'm going in super light with this highlight shade and gradually building it up in areas. That's why I'm inserting the footage of like the comparison between like the left and right arm and foot so that you can actually see that I have painted with something on this, because half the time in this footage I feel like it looks like I'm doing absolutely nothing to these pieces. But that is unfortunately the reality of when you are painting really natural stuff. Is it is a slow build-up process. You do not want this to be a stark contrast all of a sudden, so I will go back and forth around the same areas like 6 or 7 times, just gradually building up whatever shade, whether that be lighter areas or darker areas, and creating all of those in between values. Even though it is just using the single paint color, using it in different areas at different opacities gives it an entirely different effect. Since I am treating this as a highlight shade, I'm mostly focusing on any of the high points, so really trying to bring out some of those wrinkle details. I did focus more around the ears to try and fake that translucent effect that he seems to have on his ears. Most creatures' ears have that translucency to them because they are much more thin parts of the body compared to, you know, the solid head. And since this head isn't made of a more skin-like material like silicone, we're just gonna fake it with some paint. Next up was the shadow color. Now, this was an incredibly translucent dark green shade. You don't want this paint to be anywhere even close to opaque, or Yoda's gonna start looking like a zebra. And with this, I'm not trying to go into like every single wrinkle crevice across the entire body. I'm just trying to pick out certain areas, darken those up with it, just really try and break up those 2 green colors that we have on this right now to try and give it, again, a very natural effect. I mean, if you look at the back of your hand, you can see all of the subtle colors that are there. You know, you can see your veins through your hand skin normally, and so trying to create that in paint can be an interesting and tedious process, let's say. The name of the game is gradual build-up of color. Normally, I would say that an airbrush would not be required for whatever paint job I'm deciding to do for a video, but this might be one of those few times where really an airbrush is like the only way that you could really achieve the subtle tonal differences, at least more easily. Like here I'm using the properties of the airbrush and using it to splatter that dark color all over the head to create age spots, essentially. He's looking pretty great for somebody in his 800s, but there are some age spots involved still. Next, I'm going in with some watered down beigey, more yellowy colors. This is to mostly break up some of that green and also give the illusion of those more fleshy areas. You know, same idea how on humans there tends to be a color difference between like the palm of your hand versus the back of your hand, or like the bottoms of your feet. He isn't really pink though. Like for Grogu, he is like definitely more of a pink tone in these areas, but from any of the reference reference photos of CGI Yoda, it is definitely more of just like a toned down green, almost to the point of like a yellowish beige color. So I am mostly focusing on those previously mentioned areas, but I did spray a little bit here and there just to keep the color harmony between the entire piece. You know, you don't want him to look like a clown all of a sudden with there like only being that yellow color on the upper parts of his cheeks and then it not being like anywhere else on his entire face. So even if you're not really applying it very much to any of like the non-specific fleshy parts, it just is like nice color balance to put just a little bit in some areas across the part. And that pretty much wraps up the airbrushing portion of this skin paint job, but now we're on to the brush work. Started off with adding a bit of green wash to certain areas. There's just so many fine wrinkles to these pieces that I would have no hope of airbrushing in the darker colors, so wash was the best way to achieve this. This did not go all over these pieces though, it was just very concentrated to the areas that I wanted a bit more definition in those wrinkles and to deepen certain sections up. I also used this green wash to splatter some more age spots onto Yoda's face. The other ones that I put on disappeared a little, so wanted to have ones that were a little bit more visible to give his facial skin just that extra touch of realism. Next up were the nails. I started with this off-white color, nothing too yellow. We're going to be adding that yellowish tinge later on because I didn't want to run the risk of these turning out to be like overly yellow. Like they tend to not really be as saturated as you probably assume if you really look at the color. So off-white it is. Give Yoda a mani-pedi. You can add some nail art while you're at it if you want. I did also mostly concentrate this color towards the tips of the nails and then gradually blended and dry brushed it up when it got closer to the finger. And then it was on to that yellowish brown wash. I'm pretty much completely blotting it off of the tips of the nails so that that yellowish color is really only concentrated towards the base, and then I'm further going in with some brown paint to give it that like grungy-ish old green alien nail effect that they all seem to have. I did also pull in some of that color and dry brushed it around certain areas of the foot. Again, color harmony, trying to make all of this look as natural as possible. And that's where I was calling the paint job on Yoda complete, which meant that I could go ahead and start removing the blue tack from his eyeballs. This ended up working out absolutely perfectly. There was no paint where I didn't want it to be on these eyes, and that left only one step to still do to this head, and that was adding hair. I ended up using this, it's technically like stuffing, but it's more cotton based than polyester, so it is a much softer and straight texture. It was absolutely perfect for Yoda's hair. It looked exactly like it, which is why I decided to use it. And gluing on hair to a green creature's head is possibly the most tedious process that you will ever undertake. I just used some white craft glue for this. It dries completely clear, so you will not see it whatsoever, and it will just look like the hair is left. So a very natural effect, but with Yoda specifically, you really do need to watch that you're not adding too much hair at a time. So I'm really thinning out the amount that I'm like grabbing from my little ball of stuffing. And even though he's an 800+ year-old balding alien, it did still take me an entire afternoon to glue this small amount of hair to his head. And the final thing that needed painting was the cane. I started out with a base coat of a chocolate brown color, airbrushed that all over, and this is actually going to be the only airbrushing we do to this piece. We're going to be switching to hand painting the rest. I grabbed a collection of brown paints, everything from that more typical chocolate brown all the way to more taupes and golden shades, and I'm kind of just grabbing a bit of every color and streaking it all over the surface of this cane. Wood can just have so many subtle differences in tone, and I figured this might be the best way to approach painting this piece. I don't know if I've ever truly painted something wood like this, but if you've ever watched someone repair wood furniture or anything, you will see how they like streak and marble a lot of different tones of brown together to try and get it to match the rest of the actual wood, because that's the easiest way to create that super natural effect. And here's what all of that ended up looking like. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what color Yoda's cane is supposed to be, so this mid-tone mystery wood brown was good enough for me. The last thing that this Jedi Master needed was is some clothes. My mom did an incredible job at making this little jumpsuit and robe for Yoda. She made the robe exactly the same way that you would make a Jedi robe for a full-size human, and just shrunk everything down to little green men scale. All that was left to do was get Yoda dressed, get all of his limbs attached and everything lined up, and finally give him his cane. And here's the finished Jedi Master Yoda. I hope you enjoyed seeing the process of bringing Jedi Master Yoda to life, but now let's talk more in depth about this printer. You've probably heard me mention it before in videos, but I live somewhere where like 5 to 6 months out of the year, it's too cold outside for me to do my usual prop building and post-processing routine. So during those months, I almost exclusively use resin printers for my projects. They don't require the same type or even any post-processing, which means I can continue building to my heart's content. But as you also probably have noticed, not a big maker of small projects over here, so the bigger the resin printer, the better for me. And I can tell you that this Frozen Sonic Mega 8KS is going to be keeping me very busy this winter. You saw it throughout this video doing an absolutely incredible job at printing these Yoda pieces, but there are so many well thought out details and features with this printer that it makes it one of the best resin printers that I have ever used. I mean, first of all, you can see it is an absolutely gloriously large resin printer, but its actual build volume is 33 centimeters by 18.5 centimeters by 30 centimeters tall. I know, resin printer dimensions are never easy to remember. As the name would suggest, it has an 8K screen, which isn't the highest resolution ever, but since it is such a large printer, I feel like the majority of people that are probably interested in this machine are looking at it for printing those large pieces that quite literally cannot fit on any other printer. And for those larger pieces, 8K is more than enough resolution. It technically works out to 43 microns for anyone interested. As with most resin printers, it is a very easy setup. All you're pretty much having to do is work on getting it out of the box and removing any packaging material. This printer was actually even easier than most because it comes with a pre-leveled build plate, which is very nice. It's never typically difficult to level a build plate, but I'm always a bit paranoid that I'm somehow going to mess it up and it's going to result in a bunch of print failures, so not having to worry about it immediately was much appreciated. I've had building a Yoda on my to-do list for years at this point, but it just so happened to work out that he was honestly like the perfect test print case. I managed to basically max out the print volume between the various build plates worth of pieces, and he's one of those rare projects that is, I mean, you can't really call him large, but a larger project that continuously has a large amount of detail all over with all of his skin texture and wrinkles. So not only did it give a great idea as to the scale that this printer is capable of printing at, but also the detail that can then be all over those pieces. The first thing that I actually printed on the Mega 8KS though was a second sister lightsaber. Like all Inquisitor sabers, it has those large circular fins that are just large enough to not like fitting on the majority of resin printers. Not only did those large fins fit on this printer, but it also left me enough room to print the entire rest of the lightsaber on the same build plate, which if you don't know, resin printers don't work the same way as FDM printers. You are basically calculating print time by height, so regardless of how much you have on the build plate, it's going to take the same amount of time for that, like say 2-inch piece, whether you're printing one of them or 20 of them. So when you do have these larger printers with that bigger build plate, you can really start pumping out the pieces really fast because you can take advantage of the extra pieces that you can then all of a sudden fit on that larger build plate. For the second sister lightsaber, I used some red aqua hyperfine resin and the parts looked absolutely gorgeous out of it. They turned out super smooth with this really nice matte finish that honestly makes me almost not want to paint them because they look really cool right now as is. But yeah, those pieces turned out perfectly, super smooth, and you know, while it is amazing that resin printers can produce all of this extraordinary detail in the pieces, it's equally as important and useful for the machines to be able to produce perfectly smooth pieces. I would say it's probably like 50-50 for me as to what I use resin printers for in terms of needing it for smoothness versus detail. And yeah, I would say the Mega 8KS definitely passes both of those tests. While I personally am more likely to be always using this machine's build volume for those larger pieces, its build volume also could come in handy with batch printing. I suppose depending on what you would be looking at batch printing, that's where that 8K screen maybe isn't quite up for the job, depending on just how fine of an object you are batching at a time. It does have the capability if on like every other printer you can only fit, say, 20 of a certain object on that build plate, and all of a sudden this printer you can fit like 40. That is a massive time save if you are having to produce the same objects over and over again. This printer has so many quality of life features that I cannot stress how much I appreciate. Pretty much every other thing that I've ever complained about on a resin printer that I've tried out is not an issue with this machine, which is lovely for a change. The main one that I have to start out with is the drip hanger. I go on pretty much every time I test out a new resin printer about how I wish so desperately that companies would start to consider actually adding a drip hanger as part of the machine, or at the very least put it on the USB stick so that you could print one immediately. It is just such a necessary feature for me that I use every single time I print something. So the Mega 8KS already having one as part of the printer's design is chef's kiss. This one's like a solid metal hook system that's part of the build plate holder, and it uses the handles that are on the build plate itself to hang off of. The handles on the build plate as well as the vat are also details that I absolutely love. Resin printers just have the capacity to create far more messes than FDM printers do. You are working with a liquid resin, and the larger you go for printers, the higher capacity for mess there is. And also when you start getting into the larger printers, the physical pieces themselves also start to get heavier and also possibly more unruly. There being handles as part of the design on these parts make things just so much easier and less chance of there being some sort of accidental mess, because you're not having to worry so much about the handling of those objects being such a big deal. I mean, the build plate on its own without there being any prints on it is 2.5 kilograms. I don't know if it ever would have really come across on camera, but the torso and leg build plate that I have was something else for me to handle. Thankfully, it didn't create any mess, but it just had so much resin on it, and those pieces were hollow, so you could easily have created an even heavier object to have to wangle and deal with on that build plate. And I don't even want to think about how you would go about even trying to not make a mess of everything if there weren't handles to like easily securely grab onto with all of that weight. The vat is also massive, which is not me complaining. It can hold 1.5 liters of resin, which for the most part is like more than enough for what you need. I believe the only build plate that went over that 1.5 liters in terms of the estimate that the slicer was giving me was that torso and leg build plate. Frozen do also make the resin pump and fill that you can add to this machine, which is where you can attach a bottle of resin that will gradually pump into the vat when it starts to sense that there isn't as much resin remaining. Incredibly handy on these larger printers given how much resin you can be using on single print jobs, but it is really nice to see the vat capacity on its own being so large. I kind of just have nothing but good things to say about this printer. I mean, nothing went wrong. I had no print failures, which wouldn't inherently be the machine itself's fault. You know, I suppose it's worth mentioning. The one thing I was a little unsure about was how the holes in the build plate would react, or I guess if it would make it more difficult or easier to actually remove the prints off of the build plate. Because I will say, removing large prints from large resin printers can occasionally be quite a difficult task. So you could be dealing with a very heavy object on an already heavy build plate, and then sometimes that object just does not want to release itself from said build plate. But I actually think the holes make it easier to remove, which I suppose makes sense. It felt like once I could get my scraper under a certain amount of the object, it would like release the suction from the other holes and just sort of pop off. The only real downside to the design with the holes is sometimes you can still find like little bits of cured resin that are left in the hole. I would assume it's probably from the initial scraping with the scraper that you kind of slice off the part of the cured resin that's like physically within the hole with the rest of the piece. You know, just something to keep in mind, making sure that all of those little cured bits of resin are removed from any of those holes so that you don't possibly risk any damage to the FEP sheet on the machine. I do also really like the flip up shroud. With there not being any part of the shroud that's removable, it means that while this is quite a large printer, it keeps the profile of the machine to exactly what it is. You know, you're never having to worry about the extra space of removing the shroud like above the entire machine or taking the front off and then needing to store that front piece of the shroud somewhere. It just seems like Phrozen actually put a lot of thought behind their design choices to make the user experience with the Mega 8KS as seamless as it possibly could be. There's really nothing that I can think of that it's like, oh, I wish this was a thing, or I was missing this, I wish it had that. Like, no, the printer works. It has everything that I could hope for in terms of features, even then some. It's one of those rare times where it's just an incredible machine as is. If you want to find out even more information about the Phrozen Sonic Mega 8KS, there will be links in the description box. But that is everything. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.